I remember the exact moment it all fell apart. My name is Isabel, and I'm 37 years old. I should have known better, but hindsight has a way of sharpening things you didn't want to see. That morning was quiet, deceptively so. The kind of quiet that makes you believe everything is fine, even when it isn't. I was sitting in the corner of the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows, turning the granite countertops into a shimmering canvas. It used to make me happy, this house, this life we built. But lately, it felt like I was just sitting in a museum of my past choices, admiring things that no longer belonged to me. The coffee in front of me had long gone cold, but I hadn't noticed. My phone was warm in my hand, the screen lighting up every few seconds with another message from Jordan. He was funny, attentive, and he remembered things about me that I didn't think anyone cared to notice anymore. Like the way I always added cinnamon to my coffee, or how I hated when people chewed too loudly. Ethan used to notice things like that. He used to laugh at how particular I was about everything. But now, we barely laughed at all. Jordan's latest message popped up. Did he say anything about last night? My stomach flipped. It wasn't guilt exactly. I hadn't done anything. Not really. But there was a line, and I'd been towing it for weeks now. Ethan didn't know about the late-night texts or the long lunches that stretched into hours of me spilling my frustrations to Jordan. At least I didn't think he did. Ethan was in the next room, the soft hum of his laptop the only indication. He was there at all. He worked from home most days now, but we might as well have been living in separate worlds. I wanted to ask him something, anything, just to hear his voice. But every time I thought about it, the words stuck in my throat. He hadn't asked me about last night, about why I came home so late. Maybe he didn't care anymore. I typed back, to Jordan. No, nothing. He doesn't even notice. The words felt like both a betrayal and a relief. Jordan responded almost immediately. Maybe he's taking you for granted. You deserve more than that. My chest tightened. I hated how much I wanted to believe him. Ethan's footsteps broke the silence, the sound of him coming into the kitchen jolting me like a sudden storm. I locked my phone and slid it onto the counter, grabbing my coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world. Morning, he said, his voice low and even. He poured himself a cup of coffee, not looking at me. Morning, I replied, forcing a smile that he didn't see. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I waited for him to ask me about last night. He didn't. Instead, he leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone like I wasn't even there. I don't know what came over me, but the words just spilled out. Do you even care where I was last night? He looked up then, his eyes calm but unreadable. I assumed you were with a friend, he said. There was no accusation in his tone, no curiosity, just a simple statement. Is that it? I asked, my voice rising. You just assumed and didn't bother to ask? Don't you care at all? He set his coffee down, his movements deliberate. Do you want me to care? He asked, his voice steady. The question hit me like a slap. Of course, I wanted him to care. I wanted him to ask where I was, who I was with, why I came home hours after I said I would. I wanted him to fight for me, to show me that I still mattered. But instead of saying any of that, I lashed out. I was with Jordan, I said, the words laced with defiance. And he cares. He listens to me, Ethan. He actually notices when something's wrong. Ethan stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded once, slowly. If that's what you want, Isabel, then maybe you should be with him. The air left the room, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. This wasn't how he was supposed to react. He was supposed to get angry, to demand answers, to fight for me. Instead, he was calm, detached, like I wasn't worth the effort. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ethan didn't wait for me to find them. He picked up his coffee, walked back to his office, and closed the door behind him. I stood there, frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. He called, my bluff, and I wasn't ready for it. I stood in the kitchen long after Ethan had closed the door, the echo of his words ringing in my ears. I couldn't decide if I was more shocked by his reaction or by the hollow feeling settling in my chest. I should have been relieved, shouldn't I? He gave me the opening, the freedom to walk away, to step into a life I'd been daydreaming about for months. But instead, I felt like I'd been struck in the center of my chest. I grabbed my phone off the counter and stared at Jordan's last message. "You deserve more than that." The words now felt heavier, as if they'd been mocking me this whole time. Did I really deserve more? Or was I just convincing myself that what I had wasn't enough? My thumb hovered over the keyboard, wanting to tell him what had just happened, but I couldn't bring myself to type it. The house was quiet again, the kind of silence that made everything louder. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the hum of the fridge, and the occasional creak of the floorboards as I shifted my weight. I wanted to storm into Ethan's office and demand he explain himself. Why wasn't he fighting? For me? Why wasn't he angry? Instead, I found myself standing in front of the door to his office, my hand poised to knock. But then I stopped. What would I even say? That I didn't mean it? That I wasn't actually going to leave? Or that I wanted him to care more than he apparently did? None of it sounded right. I retreated to the living room and sank into the couch, my mind racing. Memories of us flashed through my head. Our first date, the way he used to make me laugh. So hard I couldn't breathe. The nights we'd stay up talking about everything and nothing at all. When had it all changed? Was it after the promotion that had him working late nights and traveling more often than he was home? Or was it me, slowly drifting away while convincing myself that he'd already let go? The sound of Ethan's office. Door opening pulled me from my thoughts. I straightened, hoping he'd come into the living room, say something, anything, to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. But he didn't. He walked upstairs without so much as a glance in my direction. I sat there, staring at the empty hallway, the weight of his indifference pressing down on me. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I looked down to see another message from Jordan. "You okay? You've been quiet." My first instinct was to reply, to pour out everything I was feeling, to seek comfort in the one person who seemed willing to give it. But something stopped me. For the first time, I wondered if I was leaning on Jordan because I wanted him or because I wanted what he represented: attention, validation, the feeling of being wanted again. I set the phone down and stared at it like it was a live wire, dangerous and unpredictable. My heart was racing, and I hated how torn I felt. Ethan's words replayed in my mind. "If that's what you want, Isabel, then maybe you should be with him." But was that what I wanted? I thought about Jordan, about the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room, the way he listened so intently, like every word I said mattered. It was intoxicating, yes, but also fleeting. He didn't know me, not really. He knew the version of me I let him see, the one who smiled and laughed and pretended to have it all together. Ethan knew the real me. He'd seen me at my worst and stayed anyway. At least he used to. But now I wasn't so sure. The sound of the front door opening startled me, and I turned to see Ethan stepping outside, his car keys in hand. He didn't say a word, didn't tell me where he was going or when he'd be back. I watched him through the window as he got into his car and drove away, the taillights disappearing down the street. The knot in my stomach tightened. I wanted to believe he'd gone to clear his head, to think about what I'd said and come back ready to fight for us. But a small, insistent voice in the back of my mind whispered something else entirely. What if he wasn't coming back? For the first time, the possibility of him leaving felt real, and it terrified me. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I was supposed to have the upper hand, to be the one deciding whether to stay or go. But now, the decision felt like it was slipping out of my grasp, and I wasn't ready for the consequences. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, and buried my face in my hands. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, regret, and something else I couldn't quite name. I wanted to fix it, to take back the words I'd said, but I didn't. No how. The house felt emptier than it had in years, and for the first time I realized just how much I'd taken for granted. Ethan's presence, his steadiness, his quiet way of being there even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. And now I was on the verge of losing it all. I didn't move from the couch for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. The silence in the house had transformed into something oppressive, suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. Ethan's car was gone, the driveway empty, and the weight of not knowing where he'd gone pressed against my chest like a stone. I picked up my phone again. Jordan had sent another message. "Hey, just checking in. Let me know if you need to talk." His concern was like a lifeline, something to grab onto in the middle of the chaos I'd created. My fingers hovered over the screen, torn between wanting to respond and feeling like doing so would be crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Instead, I opened Ethan's contact. My thumb hovered over the call button, the absurdity of what I was doing hitting me all at once. I was his wife, and yet it felt like I needed permission to reach out to him. My chest tightened as I realized that I didn't even know if he'd answer. I stared at his name, willing myself to hit call, but I couldn't. I set the phone, back down, and leaned against the back of the couch, exhaling a shaky breath. The minutes stretched, my thoughts running in endless loops. I replayed our argument in the kitchen over and over again, dissecting every word, every inflection in his voice. There was something about the way he'd said it. "If that's what you want, Isabel." It wasn't resigned, not exactly. It was calm, almost serene, and that was what scared me most. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't trying to manipulate me into staying or begging for him to care. He was giving me the choice, and for the first time, I realized I had no idea what to do with it. I got up and started pacing the living room, the weight of indecision coiling in my chest. Memories began flooding back, unbidden. The time Ethan drove 2 hours in a snowstorm to bring me soup when I was stuck at my parents' house with the flu. The way he'd stayed up all night with me when I got the call about my father's heart attack, holding me while I cried until there were no tears left. The way he used to kiss the top of my head every morning before leaving for work, even when he thought I was still asleep. When had I stopped noticing those things? When had they stopped being enough? I wandered into the kitchen, absently cleaning up the half-empty coffee mug I'd abandoned earlier. The motions were mechanical, but they gave my hands something to do while my mind churned. I was scrubbing the counter when I noticed something sitting on the corner of the table, a small notebook with a pen resting on top of it. It was Ethan's. I hesitated for a moment, then picked it up and flipped through the pages. Most of it was filled with scribbled notes and to-do lists, things that probably made sense to him but were incomprehensible to me. But toward the back, the handwriting shifted. It was neater, more deliberate. I skimmed the first few lines, my heart sinking as I realized what it was. It was a list of things he'd been trying to do for me. Take Isabel to that Italian place she likes. Friday? Look up that book she mentioned. Ask her about her mom. I stared at the page, my chest tightening with each line. These were the things he thought would fix us, the things he believed I wanted. And maybe they were once. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped giving him any clue about what I actually needed. I'd let the silence grow between us, assuming he didn't care, when the truth was that I hadn't made it easy for him to care. My eyes blurred, and I set the notebook back on the table, feeling the sting of guilt rise up to choke me. I'd been so busy cataloging all the ways Ethan had fallen short that I hadn't stopped to think about the ways I'd failed him too. The sound of a car engine startled me, and I rushed to the window. Ethan's car was back in the driveway, his silhouette visible behind the wheel. He didn't get out right away, sitting there for a moment before finally stepping out and walking toward the house. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I was going to say to him, but I knew I couldn't let things stay the way they were. The front door opened and Ethan stepped inside, his expression unreadable, as he set his keys on the counter. "Hey," I said softly, my voice catching in my throat. He looked at me, his gaze steady but distant. "Hey." The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. I searched for the right words, but everything I thought of felt inadequate, too small to bridge the gap that had formed between us. Finally, I just blurted it out. "I don't want to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't want to leave, Ethan." His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, something I couldn't quite name. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. Then what do you want, Isabel? The question hung in the air, and for the first time I realized I didn't have an answer. Ethan's question cut through the haze in my mind like a cold wind, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. What did I want? It seemed like such a simple question, one I should have been able to answer without hesitation. But as I stood there, searching for words, I realized I didn't know. I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The truth of it was humiliating, but I couldn't pretend anymore. I thought I knew, but now, I don't. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. That's honest, he said, his tone neutral, almost clinical. But it wasn't cruel, and for that, I was grateful. He didn't press me, didn't demand explanations or apologies. He just stood there waiting, and somehow that made the weight of the silence even heavier. I felt the urge to fill it, to say something that would fix things, but I didn't even know where to start. My hands fidgeted at my sides as I tried to gather my thoughts. I didn't mean what I said earlier, I began, stumbling over the words. About Jordan, about leaving. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying me. Didn't you? The question wasn't accusatory, but it felt like a spotlight had been turned on me, illuminating everything I'd tried to keep hidden. I meant it. In the moment, maybe. Or at least, I'd wanted him to believe I did. But now, faced with the reality of losing him, the idea of leaving felt like an abyss I wasn't ready to step into. I don't know, I said again, my voice breaking. I don't know anything anymore. I just feel so... I stopped, struggling to find the right word. Lost? He offered, his voice softer this time. I nodded, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. Yes, lost and angry and lonely, and I don't know how we got here, Ethan. I don't know how to fix it. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders softening slightly. For a moment, he looked as tired as I felt. Neither do I, he admitted, his honesty catching me off guard. I've been trying to figure it out for months, Isabel, but I can't. Do it alone. The guilt hit me like a wave, crashing over me and pulling me under. How had I not seen it? He'd been trying, quietly, in his own way, but I'd been so focused on what I thought was missing that I hadn't noticed what he was still giving. I'm sorry, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I've been so focused on everything I thought you weren't doing that I didn't see how hard this must have been for you too. Ethan didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his expression unreadable as he seemed to weigh my words. It has been hard, he said finally. But it's not just on you. I've made mistakes too. I shut down when I should have spoken up. I let the distance grow instead of fighting it. His words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so long painting him as the distant, detached one, but hearing him admit his own struggles made me realize how much I'd been projecting my own insecurities onto him. What do we do now? I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he said again, his honesty cutting through me. But I think the first step is figuring out what you really want, Isabel. Not just from me, but from yourself, from your life. Because until you know that, we're just going to keep going in circles. His words landed like a heavy truth I couldn't ignore. He was right, of course. I'd spent so much time looking for answers outside myself, through Jordan, through my resentment toward Ethan, that I hadn't stopped to ask the most important question. What did I want? I don't want to lose you, I said, my voice cracking. I know that much. Ethan's expression softened, a flicker of something hopeful crossing his face. That's a start, he said quietly. But it's not enough, Isabel, not by itself. I nodded, swallowing hard. I know. For the first time in months, the air between us didn't feel suffocating. It wasn't comfortable, not yet, but it wasn't unbearable either. It felt open, like we'd finally cleared away just enough of the wreckage to see the foundation beneath. I'll try, I said, meeting his eyes. I'll try to figure it out. Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. So will I. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It felt like a pause, a moment to breathe before taking the next step. I didn't know where we were headed or if we'd make it through, but for the first time, I felt like we had a chance. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were strange, caught somewhere between repair and uncertainty. Ethan and I moved around each other carefully, as if we were afraid that one wrong step might shatter whatever fragile truce we'd managed to create. There were no dramatic declarations or sudden fixes, just small, tentative gestures that felt both hopeful and painfully inadequate. The first morning after our conversation, I woke up earlier than usual. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the whirlwind in my mind. Ethan's side of the bed was empty, the faint smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. The absence of his warmth felt sharper than I expected, but I pushed the thought aside and got up. When I walked into the kitchen, he was standing by the counter, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I entered, his expression neutral but not cold. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, my voice soft. He gestured toward the coffee pot. "I made extra if you want some." I nodded, grateful for the small kindness. "Thanks." We didn't say much as I poured myself a cup and sat at the table. The silence between us wasn't exactly comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was tentative, like we were both waiting to see what would happen next. I thought about the list I'd found in his notebook, the small ways he'd been trying to reach me without me even noticing. It was humbling and a little shameful to realize how much I'd overlooked. As I sipped my coffee, I found myself searching for something to say, something that might bridge the gap. "You've been working a lot lately," I said finally, my voice hesitant. Ethan glanced at me, his brows furrowing slightly. "Yeah, I guess I have." Is it because of us?" The question felt dangerous, but I needed to know. He set his phone down and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Partly," he admitted. "It's easier to stay busy than to deal with everything. But it's not just that. Work's been demanding, and I haven't been good at balancing it with everything else." I nodded, his honesty catching me off guard. "I didn't realize," I said quietly. "I just thought—" I don't know what I thought. Ethan gave a small, humorless laugh. "You thought I didn't care," he said, not unkindly. The words stung because they were true. "I'm sorry," I said, meeting his gaze. "I know I've been distant too, and unfair." He studied me for a moment, his expression softening. "We both have," he said simply. It wasn't an absolution, but it felt like the closest thing to one I could hope for right now. Later that day, I found myself staring at my phone again, Jordan's messages still sitting unread. I hadn't responded to him since that night, and I knew he'd noticed. Part of me wanted to reply, to explain everything, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What could I even say? That I'd used him as an escape, a way to avoid dealing with the cracks in my marriage? That I'd let him believe I wanted something I wasn't ready to commit to? The truth was, Jordan wasn't the problem. He was just a symptom of something deeper, a distraction from the work I hadn't been willing to do. I opened his last message and stared at it for a long time before finally typing a response. "Hey, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I need to focus on my marriage right now. I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression or led you on. That wasn't fair to you." I hesitated for a moment before hitting send, my heart pounding as I watched the message disappear. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for now, that was enough. Ethan came home late that evening, his tie loosened and his face tired but calm. I was sitting in the living room, a book in my lap, though I hadn't read a single page. He glanced at me as he walked in, a small flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You're still up," he said, setting his briefcase down by the door. "I wanted to wait for you," I said, the words feeling both foreign and familiar. He paused for a moment before nodding, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Thanks. We didn't talk much that night, but we sat together on the couch, the quiet between us feeling just a little less heavy. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving in the same direction. As I lay in bed later that night, Ethan's steady breathing beside me, I realized something that I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Fixing this wasn't going to be easy or quick. It wasn't about one conversation or one breakthrough. It was about the small, quiet choices we made every day to show up for each other, even when it was hard. And for the first time, I felt like I was ready to try. The next few weeks passed in slow, unsteady progress. Ethan and I weren't exactly us again, but the bitterness that had settled into our lives for so long began to dissipate. It wasn't replaced by anything grand, no sweeping declarations, no fairy tale moments, but by something simpler. A fragile kind of effort, like two people trying to learn a language they'd once been fluent in, but had forgotten over time. I started to notice the little things about him again, the habits and quirks that used to make me smile but had gone unnoticed for too long. The way he hummed under his breath when he thought no one was listening. How he ran a hand through his hair when he was deep in thought. The way he still turned the TV volume down when I fell asleep on the couch, even if he was in the middle of a show. It wasn't just him, though. I started noticing things about myself, too. How tightly I clung to my frustrations, how quick I was to assume the worst. I'd spent so much time tallying Ethan's mistakes that I hadn't realized how unwilling I'd been to look at my own. That realization was sobering, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I felt like I had some control over where we went from here. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I decided to ask him something that had been weighing on me. "Do you think we were happy before?" I asked, my voice tentative. Ethan looked up from his plate, his expression thoughtful. "Before when?" "Before all of this," I said, gesturing vaguely. "Before things got so complicated." He leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I think we were," he said finally. "But I also think we ignored a lot of things that weren't working because it was easier than dealing with them." I nodded, his honesty cutting through me. "Like what?" He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might brush the question off. But then he sighed and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Like the way we stopped talking about anything real," he said. "We used to tell each other everything, even the hard stuff. Somewhere along the way, we stopped doing that. I don't know why, but I think that's when things started to fall apart." I swallowed hard, his words hitting closer to home than I wanted to admit. "I think you're right," I said quietly. "And I think I was scared that if I told you how I really felt, it would just make things worse." Ethan studied me for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Maybe I felt the same way," he said. "Maybe we were both so afraid of losing each other that we didn't realize we were pushing each other away." The thought was both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. It didn't absolve us of the hurt we'd caused each other, but it reminded me that neither of us had set out to destroy what we had. We'd just been lost, fumbling in the dark without a map. That night, as we cleaned up the kitchen together, Ethan glanced at me and said, "Do you want to go for a walk?" It was such a small question, but it felt monumental. We hadn't done something as simple as take a walk together in years. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yeah," I said. "I'd like that." We walked in silence for a while, the cool evening air wrapping around us. The world felt quieter, slower, as if the universe had paused to give us this moment. Ethan walked beside me, his hands in his pockets, his steps steady. "I don't want to keep living like this," I said finally, breaking the silence. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Neither do I." I stopped walking, turning to face him. "I want us to be better," I said, my voice trembling. "I know it's not going to happen overnight, and I know we've both made mistakes, but I want to try. I don't want to give up on us." Ethan stopped too, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, I thought he might look away or dismiss what I'd said, but then he nodded. I want to try too, he said, but we can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. We have to be honest, even when it's hard. I know, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'm ready for that. We stood there for a moment, the streetlight casting a soft glow over us. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were standing on the same ground. As we continued our walk, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. We might not be able to go back to the way things were, but maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was finding a way forward, together, and for the first time that felt like enough. The days stretched into weeks, and the fragile truce Ethan and I had established began to feel more like a genuine connection. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was an honesty between us that hadn't existed for a long time. Conversations that used to feel like landmines were now cautious but open. We tread carefully, learning each other's boundaries and vulnerabilities all over again. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie neither of us was paying attention to, Ethan broke the comfortable silence. Do you still think about him? He asked, his voice steady but quiet. I stiffened, the question pulling me sharply out of the moment. I turned to look at him, his face calm but expectant. He wasn't accusing me, he was asking, and that made it so much harder. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to be honest. I think about what he represented, I said slowly. Not him exactly, but the idea of him. An escape. A chance. To feel wanted, like I mattered to someone again. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, as if he'd already guessed the answer. And now? Now. I hesitated, searching for the right words. Now I see it differently. He wasn't the answer. I was just running from everything I didn't want to face here, with us and with myself. Ethan leaned back, his eyes on me, but his expression unreadable. That's fair, he said after a moment. I guess I can't blame you for wanting an escape. I've wanted one too, in my own way. I blinked, startled by his admission. You have? He nodded, exhaling slowly. Not with another person, but with work. Staying late, taking on extra projects. It was easier than coming home and feeling like I was failing you. The vulnerability in his words caught me off guard. I'd always thought of his long hours as indifference, but now I could see it for what it really was. Avoidance, just like my own. I never wanted you to feel like you were failing me, I said softly. I know, he replied, his voice heavy. But it's how I felt. Like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of his words settling over us. I thought about all the times I'd resented him for being distant, for not trying harder, without ever considering what it must have felt like from his side. I don't want to be that person anymore, I said finally. The one who makes you feel like you're not enough. I don't want to hold on to this anger and resentment. It's not fair to either of us. Ethan looked at me, his gaze steady. I don't want to be the person who makes you feel like you have to look elsewhere to feel valued, he said. I know I've let you down, Isabel, more times than I can count, but I want to do better. His words hung in the air, a fragile promise that felt as much like a challenge as an offering. We've both made mistakes, I said, my voice trembling. But I don't think it's too late to fix this. I don't know what it'll look like or how long it'll take, but I want to try. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. So do I, he said, the quiet conviction in his voice making my chest ache. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not the blind optimism of our early days, but something more grounded. It wasn't about pretending. The past hadn't happened or expecting everything to magically fall into place. It was about the work, the effort, the choice to stay and rebuild, brick by brick. That night, as we lay in bed, Ethan reached for my hand under the covers. The gesture was so simple, so familiar that it brought tears to my eyes. I squeezed his hand in return, neither of us saying a word. It wasn't a grand gesture or a perfect resolution, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. As I drifted, off to sleep, I thought about everything we still had to face, the wounds that hadn't healed, the trust that needed to be rebuilt. It would take time, patience, and more honesty than either of us had been willing to give before. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like we were standing on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. We were standing together, looking at the pieces of what we'd broken, and deciding, tentatively, but deliberately, to try and put them back together. And for the first time, I felt like we might actually have a chance. The weeks turned into months, and Ethan and I began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't seamless. There were still moments of tension, times when old wounds surfaced unexpectedly. But we were learning how to navigate them, how to sit with the discomfort without retreating into silence or defensiveness. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner, Ethan walked in and leaned against the counter. He watched me for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice careful, like he was testing the waters. "About what?" I asked, glancing at him. "About us. About everything we've been through." He hesitated, then continued. "I think it might help if we talked to someone. Together." I froze, the knife in my hand hovering above the cutting. Bored. Therapy. It wasn't the first time the idea had crossed my mind, but hearing Ethan suggest it made it feel real in a way that scared me. "You think we need therapy?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "I think it could help," he said gently. "We've been doing better, but there are things we still haven't talked about. Things we don't know how to talk about." He wasn't wrong, and I knew it. There were still parts of our relationship that felt fragile, like they might crumble if we pushed too hard. But the idea of opening up to a stranger, of laying our mess bare for someone else to see, felt daunting. "I don't know," I said, setting the knife down and turning to face him. "What if it just makes things worse?" Ethan stepped closer, his expression soft but steady. "What if it makes things better?" The question hung in the air, and I realized I didn't have an answer. A week later, we had our first session. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Harper, welcomed us into a cozy, softly lit room with shelves full of books and a vase of fresh flowers on the table. I felt exposed, sitting there with Ethan, knowing we were about to unpack the most painful parts of our lives in front of a stranger. Dr. Harper began by asking us why we were there, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "We've been struggling," he said simply. "For a long time." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "We're trying to rebuild," I added, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard." Dr. Harper nodded, her expression calm and empathetic. "Rebuilding is always hard," she said. "But the fact that you're both here, willing to try, says a lot." The session was uncomfortable at times, as we shared things we hadn't said out loud before. I talked about the loneliness I'd felt, the resentment that had built up over the years. Ethan admitted how lost he'd been, how he'd coped by burying himself in work instead of confronting what was happening between us. There were moments when I felt defensive, moments when I wanted to argue or explain myself, but Dr. Harper guided us gently, helping us see each other's perspectives without assigning blame. By the end of the session, I felt emotionally drained, but also lighter, like we'd taken the first step toward something better. Over the next few weeks, therapy became a regular part of our lives. It wasn't easy. There were sessions that left me in tears, and others that left us both feeling raw and exposed. But it was also transformative. We learned how to communicate in ways we hadn't before, how to listen without jumping to conclusions or trying to fix everything immediately. One night, after a particularly intense session, Ethan and I sat in the car in silence, the weight of the conversation still hanging between us. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Thank you for doing this with me." I looked at him, surprised by the gratitude in his voice. "I should be thanking you," I said. "You're the one who suggested it." He shook his head. "It doesn't matter who suggested it. What matters is that we're both here, trying." His words stayed with me long after we got home. For so long, I'd thought of our relationship as something we were supposed to maintain effortlessly, like it should just work if we loved each other enough. But I was starting to see it differently. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice, a commitment to keep showing up, even when it was hard. As I lay in bed that night, Ethan's arm draped loosely around me, I realized something that both frightened and comforted me. We were never going to be perfect. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt or frustration, but as long as we were willing to face them together, I believed we could make it through. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were building something real. Not a perfect marriage, but an honest one. And for the first time, that felt like enough. It had been a few months since we started therapy, and things were starting to feel different. There were still difficult moments, but there was also a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a hope that everything would magically fall into place, but a quieter, steadier hope, one that came from the effort we were both putting in. We weren't fixed, but we were working toward something. One Friday evening, after a long week of work and therapy sessions, Ethan and I decided to spend the night just being. No agendas, no heavy conversations, just the two of us, enjoying each other's company. We decided to order takeout and watch a movie we'd both seen a dozen times. It wasn't the most exciting night, but it felt perfect in its simplicity. We ate Chinese food straight from the cartons, laughing at the familiar jokes in the movie, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly here, in this moment, with him. Later, we curled up on the couch, our legs tangled together, as we both stared at the screen. I wasn't sure how much of the movie I was actually watching. I kept getting distracted by the way Ethan's hand rested on mine, by the way he brushed a strand of hair behind my ear without thinking. The little things that used to make me feel so connected to him. When the movie ended, neither of us moved. I could feel his breath, steady and warm against my cheek, and for a moment I was tempted to ignore everything we'd been through, to just stay here, in the safety of his arms. But then I remembered something, the promise we'd made to each other, to keep being honest, to keep working through the hard stuff. "I've been thinking," I said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan turned to face me, his brow furrowing slightly. "About what?" I hesitated. It wasn't a question I had an answer to yet, but it was something that had been weighing on my mind for a while. "About everything," I said finally. "About how much we've changed, how much we've had to confront." Ethan's expression softened, and I could see the quiet understanding in his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice low. "It's been a lot." I nodded. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if we're just going through the motions, if we're really there yet, or if we're just pretending to be." The question hung in the air between us, heavy with the uncertainty I couldn't shake. Ethan didn't pull away or get defensive. Instead, he took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I don't know, he said, his voice raw. "But I'm not pretending. I'm not pretending I don't want this. I'm not pretending I'm not still scared, or that I have all the answers. But I know I want to try, and I know we've already come so far." His words hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't offering false assurances. He was offering something real, something grounded in the rawness of what we'd been through. I took a deep breath, letting his words settle in. "I'm not pretending either," I said quietly. "I'm just afraid sometimes. Afraid that we'll keep stumbling, or that we'll fall back into the same patterns. I don't want to lose this." Ethan reached up and cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. "I don't want to lose this either," he said, his voice steady. "But I think if we can keep talking, keep being honest, then maybe we won't." I closed my eyes for a moment, his words washing over me like a balm. The fear was still there, lingering at the edges, but there was also something else, something stronger. Trust. The kind of trust that came from vulnerability, from showing up even when it felt hard. "I think we can do it," I said softly, my voice more certain than it had been in weeks. Ethan smiled, a small but genuine smile that made my chest tighten. I think so too. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Not because everything was fixed, but because we were both willing to keep working at it. And in that moment, that felt like enough. The next few weeks were filled with small victories and setbacks, moments of joy and moments of doubt. There were still times when the weight of our past threatened to pull us under, but we kept showing up for each other. We kept choosing to try, one day at a time. One Saturday morning, a few months after that conversation on the couch, Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, our coffee cups between us. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. For the first time in a long time, the quiet wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. I think we're doing okay, I said, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up from his coffee, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I think so too. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. I'm glad we're still here, I said, my voice soft but steady. Ethan squeezed my hand, his eyes meeting mine. Me too. And for the first time, it felt like we were no longer trying to fix something that was broken. We were just living, together, imperfectly, but choosing each other every day. And that in itself was enough. There were moments when I would catch myself thinking about what had come before, about the things I'd said, the things I'd done. I wondered sometimes if I would ever fully forgive myself for the hurt I had caused, or if I would ever stop carrying that guilt. I had thought in the beginning that leaving would solve everything, that walking away would give me the fresh start I needed, that it would help me escape the weight of the years spent in a relationship that had grown too heavy. But now, as I sat with Ethan at the kitchen table, the air between us light and unburdened by the past for the first time in a long time, I knew I had been wrong. Leaving wasn't the solution. I had wanted an escape, yes, but I had also wanted to prove something, to myself, to him, maybe even to the world. I had wanted to show that I could take control, that I could leave him and still come out on top. But that was a lie. The truth was, I had been running from myself the whole time, running from the parts of me that were broken, from the parts that had been wounded and left to fester. But now, sitting across from Ethan, I was starting to see that running hadn't solved anything. It had only pushed me further from the truth. I didn't need to run anymore. I looked at Ethan as he read the newspaper, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was a peace in his movements now, a calmness that I hadn't seen in him for years. And I realized in that moment that we weren't just surviving anymore. We were living, together. It wasn't perfect. We had our moments, our disagreements, our fears. But we had something we hadn't had before. Hope. I'm glad we didn't give up, I said softly, my voice breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan looked up from the paper, meeting my gaze. There was a softness in his eyes now, a tenderness that hadn't been there when we'd first started this journey. Me too, he said quietly. I think we've come a long way. We had, and the road ahead would still be challenging. There would be more things to face, more conversations to have, more wounds to heal. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. We didn't have all the answers. We might never have all the answers, but we were no longer standing on the edge, afraid to move forward. We were walking together, one step at a time, facing whatever came our way. I had thought that I was the one who needed to escape, but what I needed was to come back to myself, to come back to us. And so, as we sat there, in the soft morning light, I knew with a certainty I hadn't felt in a long time that this was where I was meant to be. A few months passed since that day, and while things had settled into a new routine, I could feel the weight of the past still lingering at the edges. It wasn't an oppressive weight, but a quiet reminder of how far we'd come and how far we still had to go. There were moments when the old doubts crept back in, when I would find myself wondering if we were just pretending again, if the work we were doing would eventually slip away into complacency. But I had learned to recognize those thoughts for what they were: fears. Fears that we couldn't undo the damage. Fears that the cracks would reappear and shatter everything we had rebuilt. It was one of those mornings when I felt the doubt settling in again. I was sitting in the living room, sipping my coffee, trying to focus on a book, when Ethan came in, his face tight with something I couldn't quite read. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting the book down and looking at him. He hesitated, standing in the doorway as though he wasn't sure whether to share what was on his mind. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability that had become so familiar over the past months. "I've been thinking about something," he said slowly. I braced myself. We had been doing better, but there was always the possibility that we would stumble again. The cracks were never fully gone, just covered for now. "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "About us," he said quietly, "and whether we've really dealt with everything." The question hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. We had been working so hard, so intentionally, to rebuild what we had. Had it been enough? "You're not saying you're having doubts, are you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant. "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "Not about you, but about me. About the way I've been showing up. About whether I'm really doing everything I can to make things right." I swallowed hard, trying to digest his words. "You've been showing up," I said softly. "You have. But do you think we're ready? That we've really moved forward?" Ethan exhaled slowly, looking down at the floor for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "I think we've made progress, but sometimes I wonder if we're still holding on to things. Old resentments, old ways of coping. And I'm scared that we're not truly healed yet, that we're just hiding from the hard parts." His words were a mirror to my own thoughts. I had been so focused on the progress we'd made, on the way we'd worked through so many of our issues, that I hadn't stopped to question whether we had really confronted everything. It was easier to pretend that the hard stuff was behind us, that the mistakes had been forgiven. But had they? "I don't know," I said softly, looking down at my coffee cup, my fingers tracing the rim. "I want to believe we've dealt with it all, but I don't know if we have either. I think there are things we're still avoiding." There was a long silence between us, both of us grappling with the weight of his admission and my own. The thought that maybe, just maybe, we had been skating over the real issues, focusing on the easy fixes instead of the deeper work, made my stomach tighten. "What do you think we need to do?" I asked, looking up at him. Ethan's gaze met mine, his eyes intense but gentle. "I think we need to face the hard stuff. The stuff we've been too afraid to talk about. The things we buried so deep we don't even know how to start digging them up." I nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't keep pretending we're okay if we're not really okay." It was terrifying to admit that. Terrifying to acknowledge that we might still have so much more to work through, that our journey wasn't as complete as we had hoped. But it was also a relief to know that we were willing to face it, together. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice small. "Scared that if we go there, we'll never come back, that we'll open up things we can't fix." "I'm scared too," Ethan said, his voice rough, "but I'd rather face it than keep pretending. I don't want to be afraid of the truth anymore." And in that moment, I knew that we were ready to face whatever it was that had been holding us back, ready to confront the pain we had ignored in favor of the easier conversations. It wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't going to be painless, but it would be real. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. That evening, we sat down again, just the two of us, in the quiet of our home, and we began to talk. It was slow, stumbling at first, but we got there. We talked about the things we had buried, the resentment, the hurt, the things we had done to each other without even realizing. It was raw, and it was painful, and it felt like we were peeling back the layers of something we had been afraid to uncover. But we kept talking. And somehow, through the tears and the anger and the vulnerability, we began to understand each other in a way we never had before. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still things left unsaid, things we would need time to process. But in that moment, I realized that it was okay. We were still here, still trying, still fighting for each other. And maybe that was all we needed to make it through. We weren't finished, but we were moving forward. And that, in itself, was enough. The next few weeks were filled with difficult conversations, many of which left me emotionally drained. The weight of our past hadn't disappeared, but there was something new between us now. A sense of understanding, of raw honesty that had been absent before. It wasn't always comfortable, and at times it felt like we were only taking baby steps, but it was progress. Real progress. One evening, after a particularly intense session, we sat in the car in silence, the weight of our words still heavy, in the air. I wasn't sure what to say. We had uncovered so much: pain, regret, longing, and there were moments when I felt completely overwhelmed. But when I glanced over at Ethan, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Peace. Not the kind of peace that came from avoiding conflict, but a deeper kind. The kind that came from facing it head-on, acknowledging the hurt, and still choosing to stay. "I think we're going to be okay," he said quietly, breaking the silence. His words were simple, but they hit me harder than I expected. There was no grand declaration, no promise that everything would magically fix itself. Just a quiet confidence that we were on the right path. "I think so too," I whispered back. There was a long pause before Ethan reached over, his hand finding mine. His touch was warm, reassuring, as if we had both silently agreed that, despite the pain we'd faced, we weren't giving up. Not this time. In the weeks that followed, I began to feel a shift inside me. There were still moments when I doubted, moments when the fear crept in, and I wondered if we were just fooling ourselves. But there were more moments of hope. More moments when I saw the man I had once loved, the man I still loved, not as someone who had hurt me, but as someone who was doing everything he could to make it right. And I was doing the same. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old wounds would resurface, and I would find myself retreating into my own fears. But there was also something else now, a new trust, a new commitment to each other that wasn't based on perfection, but on the willingness to keep showing up. One night, as we sat down to dinner together, the weight of the world seemed to fall away for a moment. Ethan smiled at me, his eyes soft, his expression warm. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it felt perfect for us. "I think we're finally getting there," I said, my voice more certain than I'd felt in a long time. Ethan reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "We are," he agreed. "It's been a long road, but we're getting there." In that moment, I knew that we weren't just surviving anymore. We were living, together, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be more challenges, more fears to face, but we had learned something essential in the last few months, that we could handle it, together. And in that knowledge, I found peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because we had chosen each other time and time again, even in the midst of our imperfections. And that, I realized, was the only thing that really mattered. As I sat there with Ethan, watching him smile at me, I realized that we were no longer looking back at the mistakes or the regrets. We were looking forward. And for the first time, I truly believed that we had everything we needed to face whatever came next. It wasn't going to be easy, but we were in it together. And somehow that felt like more than enough. The months that followed felt like the quiet after a storm. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean everything is calm, but that you've finally found a way to exist in the chaos without being swallowed by it. There were still moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments when the old insecurities crept in. But there was something else now too, a quiet strength. A knowing, deep inside, that no matter what came our way, we could handle it, together. I still caught myself, sometimes, looking at Ethan with the same uncertainty I'd had in the past, wondering if the love we had was enough to bridge the gaps between us, wondering if the wounds we had healed would stay healed. But those moments were fleeting. And the longer we stayed in this, the more I realized that love, in its truest form, wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, day after day, with all of your flaws and fears, and still choosing each other. One afternoon, as we sat in the park, watching the sun dip low in the sky, I felt a shift in myself. I wasn't holding my breath anymore, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't waiting for the rug to be pulled out from under me. For the first time in a long time, I was simply present. Do you think we'll ever stop questioning ourselves? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Ethan looked over at me, his expression soft. He took my hand, his fingers threading through mine in the familiar way that made my heart ache with something deep and real. I don't think we'll ever stop questioning things, he said, his voice quiet but steady. But I don't think that's a bad thing. It means we're still learning, still growing. And I think that's what matters. His words settled over me like a blanket, warm and comforting. The old fears, the ones that had always hovered at the edge of my mind, seemed less important now. What mattered wasn't the doubt. It was the commitment to keep going, to keep evolving. And for the first time, I was no longer afraid of the unknown. We didn't have all the answers. We probably never would. But we were here, together, and that was enough. As the evening turned to night, we sat side by side, the world around us fading away. I realized, in that moment, that I didn't need to have everything figured out. I didn't need to know what the future held or how we would handle every obstacle that came our way. All I needed to know was that we were in this, that we were willing to keep choosing each other, even when it felt impossible. And in that quiet, as we watched the stars begin to appear in the sky, I understood something fundamental. The journey wasn't about getting to some destination, some ideal place where everything was perfect. It was about walking together, one step at a time, even when the path was unclear. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't always be. But for the first time, I knew, deep in my bones, that we could do it. Together. I didn't need to run anymore. I didn't need to threaten to leave, or prove anything. I just needed to be here, with him. And that, in itself, was enough. Thank you for following along with this journey. If you found yourself reflecting on the complexities of relationships and the choices we make, know that you're not alone. Sometimes, the most difficult challenges lead to the most rewarding growth. If you've experienced a similar struggle, or feel ready to explore your own story, I invite you to share your thoughts or continue the conversation. Healing, change, and self-discovery are all part of the process, and every step forward is worth celebrating.